School.
Let's go.
Welcome back to Locking Horns. It's Split, and today I have with me Wolfgang Wesen, a friend of mine from another kindred. We've known each other about 6-7 years, maybe.
Give or take, yeah.
Give or take. And he's come with us this afternoon, and we're going to sit down and have a discussion and let him tell his story like we normally do. So, Wolfgang, tell me your story. How I know that you and I have had this discussion before, and you were not originally heathen, you're not originally pagan. So what was your upbringing, and how did you transition into this belief structure, this faith?
So I'm far. When I first started in this faith, this walk, this line that we call life, I was very far from it. I started out by, first and foremost, my father was a preacher. More so than that, he was an evangelist minister. So this is Sunday, waking up at 4 a.m. to get in the car by 5 a.m. to be on the road by 5:30, to be at the church 2 hours away for him to do the 10 a.m. sermon. And then to pack back in the car at noon after a luncheon and head back home. Countless days sitting on his lap or by his side watching him write sermons and really living and breathing the Christian way of life, that walk that they call life, just like how we call our own. Both of my parents were very involved in the church. My mother was one of the people who would sing on the hymn. She was oftentimes in the choir, very much so singing in the car on the way there. Dad, of course, the preacher. They both passed away very young in my life. And at that point, I realized a lot of my faith it stemmed from them. It stems from mom and dad. I'm going to quote a musical of all things. A long time ago, there was a musical called South Pacific. And one of the lines is, you have to be carefully taught. And when it comes to religion, especially in our youth, you have to be carefully taught how to pray, how to believe. Yeah. And when you remove that structure, when you remove mom and dad, and you're allowed to pray on your own, or to believe on your own, you realize there's a lot more in this world. So when I was older, I joined the service, went into the Army, and one of my particular duty points was Camp Oakley, Minnesota. I had the opportunity to sit down with a chaplain and reclass to chaplain's assistant. Did not complete the training for that because my time was up, but I stuck with it. I liked it, and I started to go to school to be a preacher, just like my dad. I thought I'd follow in Dad's footsteps. In doing so, I was issued a challenge. Take a year, don't go to church. Go to anything but church. Go to temple, go to mass, go to a mosque, go to a yogi session, I think is what one of them was.
Right.
And a year later, I came back to the same chaplain and said thank you, and walked away. At that point, I called myself a Hellenist. I grew up fascinated with comic books, and the closest thing we have to comic books at some points, especially in schools in Virginia, is mythology. Yeah. So I grew up, I adored Hephaestus. I thought it was awesome. We've got this god with a lame foot, some parental problems, and all of a sudden he's the blacksmith of the gods, making these awesome weapons. And as a kid who grew up, borderline worshiping Batman, I was like, I want to make cool weapons. So I got into it. Started looking at Hellenism. Never really practiced it. Never really prayed to Hephaestus or anything.
Studied it a bit.
But studied. Then I ran into a friend of mine, mutual friend of ours, Christopher, who was like, hey, let me introduce you to this cool new thing called Asatru, or Norse heathenry. I was like, I know a little bit. I know the big three. I know Thor, I know Odin, I know Tyr. That's what I knew, those three. I knew about the oaths of Tyr, I knew about the hanging of Odin on the tree, and I knew about Thor mostly from comic books. So when I found out he was the red-bearded, I was like, all right, show me more. And that's exactly what happened. I started to take steps into my heathen faith, and now I'm very proud to call myself a Brogisman.
Excellent. So how long have you been on the path?
Let's see. If I were to take a step back and really glance at it, it's been the greater part of a decade that I've been walking this line of faith. And with a smile, might I add.
Yeah, I know. It's when I think after about, I'd say in that 2 to 3 year mark of walking this path is when, pride came along with it. I had divulged myself into enough of, reading and, sitting down with other heathen folk to educate myself, that I really just, I took a good grasp on it, and it took me where I was needing to go in life. You bring up that you call yourself a Brogisman. How does that play out? And I know we discuss kind of like pre-episode of how we were going to do it. And that was like the last on our list, but you brought it up, so.
Okay. No, I'm actually really glad that you brought that up. So, a lot of the times people, when they first step into any faith, whether it's monotheism, Abrahamic religion, or whether it's polytheism, oftentimes people will pick a specific deity that speaks to them. Mm-hmm. Somebody who has seen great war and gone through great struggles and pain and strife oftentimes will tie themselves to Odin or to Thor and call themselves a Thorsman or an Odinsman. Somebody who takes great pride in being victorious and keeping their promises will oftentimes call themselves a Tearsman. I have the gift of gab more so than the gift of jab. I may be built like a semi, but I'm not much of a fighter anymore. Bragi, god of poetry, god of speaking, the silver-tongued soothsayer.
The king of kinnings.
He's a flight master,
yeah,
not a fight master.
The origin of flighting.
Skull.
I was talking with Jeff just yesterday as we were, we're ready for the parade, and we're just kind of kicking back and relaxing. I was like, we need to get a group of us together and actually start practicing and educating ourselves on the art of flighting.
Sign me up.
Because, we pick on each other all the time. We love each other, but we have got to belittle each other as much as possible to keep up that,
keeps us humble.
And there's a brothership thing in there.
True.
But you said that. So what's your attachment? What's your cling to Bragi?
So for me, Bragi, there's not really a lot of writing on Bragi. A lot of what we know about Bragi is that first and foremost, the god of poetry, not to be confused with Kvasir, who made the meat of poetry. That's a story for another day. But also married to Idun, goddess of beauty, and without her, there'd be no eternal life for the gods.
Right.
But Bragi is so seldomly spoken about in a negative way. Bragi is the one who's just there to talk and have a good time and share stories. And for me, stories are important. Stories are what put us from point A to point B and help us tell what happened in the past. A lot of our faith is based off of spoken history. And if it wasn't for the followers and the people behind Bragi's folk, if you will, we wouldn't have half the stories, especially considering, you consider the great fires that happened in the past, including the fires of Edinburgh, that destroyed most of our written testaments of faith. A lot of it had to be restored off of basically a glorified game of telephone. I'll tell you the story that I know, you'll tell them the story they know, and eventually someone will write it down and will have a way to share these glorious tales of victory, strife, battle, hatred, love, and war with the next generation.
Yeah. Thankfully, we were able to get some of that in the Icelandic sagas. Some.
And a lot of it is you have to not necessarily pick, but you have to have almost a web of weird, if you will, of different books. You'll have to have your Havamal, you'll have to have your Edis, you'll have to have your Icelandic grimoires, and you'll have to take the legends of Beowulf and put 1 next to 2 next to 3, and you'll see these different connections.
Yeah.
And it creates this illustrious world that we get to live in and look at and learn from and become better heathens.
So, referring to Bragi, since we're on the subject, his tongue was marked with the runes.
Yes.
You're covered in tattoos.
Yes.
Effigies to the great creatures of our lore.
Yes.
Would you think that, based on your studies, that Bragi's tongue was tattooed, branded, or those runes were magically placed?
I would say, and we'll step back here in a minute because you bring up a good point. The runes were magically placed on the tongue, in my opinion. Tattooing is not really talked about a lot, or if at all for that matter. The only real evidence we have of tattooing at that point is the Iceman that was discovered, who was covered in different markings. But we don't have a lot of that in or on the gods.
Or the how.
Exactly. But we do hear a lot about the gods self-mutilating in a way to honor a deal, whether it be sacrificing a hand or hanging themselves from a tree. It would not surprise me at all if his tongue was carved as a way to bind himself to the runes and allow him to speak so eloquently.
Maybe he spoke more eloquently before the runes were carved into his tongue.
Well, for at least a week, he stuttered.
Right.
But that's the other
I'm
great
sorry,
thing.
Odin, you have to understand. My tongue kind of messed up right
So he sounded like the dog from Looney Tunes. Right? But that's one of the things that I love about the gods is the human characteristics behind them. They have flaws. They have imperfections.
Yeah.
No one looks at other than Balder. Balder was perfect. But nobody looks at Freyr or at Frigg or at Odin or any of one and says, oh, that person is perfect. Because they make mistakes. And that's half the point of the story is to learn.
I have studied other religions as like, I'll pick up a book and read the historical notes and what have you, but it has come to me, through a few decades of religious study that the Norse pantheon of God are the most human of all the religions in the world. Everything else is in the heavens above. Some mystical creature comes along, and there's always perfection. There's always perfection. There's always perfection. And
divine intervention is usually the answer. Why did this happen?
God.
It's just God made it happen. Well, what if I have questions? That's where faith steps in. We don't have that problem because the question is, well, how did we get clouds? Well, Odin, Vili, and Ve, and Bur, technically, killed Ymir and then took his brain and made clouds. Congratulations, there you go. There's your answer. That's the end of the question.
This has been brought up before in previous episodes where we've talked about stories of exaggerations and chaos and order.
Mm-hmm.
Odin and Vili and Bur, they literally killed their father to create the world that we live on. Through chaos, established order.
Yes.
How human is that? How human is that? Because in our own lives, we have to subside the chaos, bring down the chaos so that the order may rise. It's the whole yin-yang thing again, and you see that also in other religions. But as far as like our creation story, the chaos and the order, and then it repeats, and then it repeats in the age of the gods, and it repeats in the age of the Vikings, it repeats in all ages of humanity.
It does. And even just the patricide, for that matter, if you look at, going back to Hellenism for a moment, you have Kronos, who ate his children out of fear that they would one day overthrow him, because he overthrew his father. And then what happens? His youngest child escapes, he swallows a stone instead, and then he beheads him. He kills him with his own sickle. From chaos of patricide comes order. Mm-hmm. Now, by no means am I saying go kill your dad, but what I am saying is that there will always be order from chaos.
Yeah.
And in our circumstances, we have order from chaos, and now we still continue to have chaos, but we understand where it's coming from.
Right.
We see the problem.
Yeah, and we see chaos and hope that the eventuality is that that order will rise from the ashes of this chaos.
Exactly.
So we're talking about, your connection with your gods, and specifically your Bragi.
Mm-hmm.
Why do we do that? Like I have chosen Tyr. I chose Tyr, probably a decade ago, and I don't think that I personally chose him. I think that I've established a connection with the essence of what he represents.
Yeah.
So you say, you have the gift of gab, not of jab.
It flows.
It works, I mean. Flighting master over here.
Flight master, not fight master.
Right. But you can keep this going.
Always. But the kind of sidestepping just a moment back to the beginning, a lot of the times when we're new into heathenry, we're looking for not necessarily something to hold on to, but we're looking for something that looks like us. Part of the reason people will go to a new religion or a new line of faith is because they're looking to fulfill those questions they have in their chest or in their heart. For me, I had questions that couldn't be answered by faith. I needed something that I could look at, I could learn about, I could research, and I could move towards.
I took kind of control. Well, I won't say I took control, but I think the aspects of what Tyr represents through the story, the very few stories that we have, really kind of reflected things that I was going through in my life at that time. And then I think that kind of how I transitioned from, recognizing that those aspects of those stories meant something to my life, and then using those lessons to move forward and maybe adjust how I was living. a different way of looking at how I was living, how I was reacting to things, how I envisioned things happening. It really just helps me reflect my life.
Yeah.
And what it means to be a good man, or how decisions should be handled, or how you think about the future. So how does Bragi attach to you in a similar fashion?
So I feel, especially when you're looking at anytime somebody steps into a new line of faith, anytime somebody wants to walk a little bit further one direction than they have in the past, they're looking because they have a reason to. They're looking because they have a void in their chest. Something in their heart doesn't feel quite right. And they're looking for that thing that will allow them to find it. And for people who want to come into the Norse theology of life, the Norse pantheon, or Norse polytheism, oftentimes called Asatru, or just Norse, which is just a lovely thing to be able to yell in the middle of a crowded place. Norse, heads will turn, it's great. But people will see these stories, these sagas, and they'll self-reflect. They'll put themselves in that position. When I first started talking to people who were that were Norse believers, a lot of them I first met while I was in the service, and a lot of them would tell me, oh, I'm a Thorsman. And it's because Thor is known to be a great victor when it comes to battle. They're known for going out and fighting the good fight and righting wrongs, and when someone does something wrong, they'll pin him against the wall until it's corrected. Yeah. We have great stories of certain people having to go and challenge dwarves and sons to make basically recompense. So we'll have these different gods that have a story that we can reflect with. I myself, I've fought growing up between losing my parents at a young age. I didn't have that same stability at home that a lot of kids did. So if I wanted quite literally meat on the table, sometimes that meant fighting. Sometimes that meant stealing. Sometimes that meant doing whatever it took to make sure that I was going to get fed. And, I'm not proud of everything I had to do at that point, but I had to learn to do what I needed to do to get there.
Yeah.
And as I got older and I started to deviate from that Abrahamic system of faith, and I realized that these things aren't wrong if you're doing what's right, I started to look primarily at different versions of polytheism to find, well, where do I find myself fitting? And when I started to read stories of Bragi, that's what I wanted to be. That's who I wanted to be.
Yeah.
Bragi was the god who was just known for talking, just for poetry, just for art.
Yeah.
And it is so diverse from everything that I grew up having to do and having to be, that it really spoke out to me. And I feel like a lot of people, especially when they're newer to the faith, you're almost kind of quiet about being a heathen. You're not really talking about it. You're not telling people, I'm a Thorsman, I'm an Odinman, I'm a Tyrsman, I'm a Freyasman. I've met a few of those, and they're fantastic people. You can tell who they are by the jingling of the silver bells, which is an inside joke for the Freyasmen who may listen to this. But it's something for us to hold on to and to cling to. When we find that person, we find that little bit of pride. When we find that God, we find that little bit of self-worth almost within the faith, within the sagas, that allows us to be a little bit more out, a little bit more loud, a little bit more proud. And you mentioned earlier my tattoos. That was really, for me, one of my very first public steps towards coming out, not only as a person that I wanted to be in life, but as a heathen. For example, on one arm, I have Gullenbursty, the great boar, done by Joshua Kaiser at Bad Wave Tattoo here in Virginia. We're actually in the process of scheduling the rest of this, but I'm going to have a giant golden boar on my forearm for the rest of my life. Yeah. This is a conversation starter. Mm-hmm. And for people who know the faith and know the stories, they know for a fact that this was made for a reason. And there's a whole story we can tell about that. Yeah. On my other wrist, I have a skull of a bear within a paw of a bear. I drew this when I worked in collections at a phone call center. And beneath that, I have Icelandic rune staves from the Galdabrook, a grimoire of Icelandic magic. Yeah. Our bodies are, there's the Christian saying of our bodies are a temple. My body is a billboard. And I want to be able to walk not only the heathen faith, but show people who are new and who are struggling that this is an awesome line of faith. This is an awesome place to be, and we're growing.
And that's an interesting perspective, and it differs a little bit from mine. You say your body's a billboard, and go back to that. my body's a temple, and not saying that my body is in fact a temple, but to get to the point where I was comfortably prepared to permanently put imagery of my faith on my body, that took a decade.
Yes.
Because in the beginning of me walking my path, I had it in my head that, you know, I'm not ready to tattoo something of this faith on me. I think there wasn't enough tenure of myself in the faith, and I don't think there was enough time of the faith in myself to say that when that conversation starter happens, how comfortable are you of actually talking about it? Or are you going to be lost in your conversation in trying to explain why it's on your body? Or not to say why it's on your body, but why you did it. What was your connection with this story to put this imagery on your body? Tattooing Fenris, the Wolf of Chaos, in my head has always been very tricky.
Yes.
Because the Fenris Wolf is a source of chaos and destruction, is the bringer of the twilight of the gods. Or not necessarily the bringer of, but the enactor of the chaotic unleash that eventually just destroys everything. Why would I want to put that on my body? Well, because the Fenris Wolf is the reason that we have stories of Tyr.
Yes.
Because if it weren't for that snippet of peace where the gods got together and said, okay, we got to tie him up. He's getting too big.
Yeah.
What are we going to do? And they go through the whole process of trying to figure out a way to bind this chaotic force. And Tyr steps up and said, look, I've fed him since he was a pup. He trusts no one of you but me. I'll do it. Because he's probably this big due to me. He's here because you entrusted him to me. It's my responsibility. So having a symbol of such chaos tattooed on my body, that's my responsibility. That's a way of expressing the stories of chaos in my life and in my experience, and that's a piece of my faith and how I can bring about some sort of justification of how I live. We Christians as a whole refer to their holy sources. We as heathens refer to our sources, what few we have, but of those few sources, the idea of interpretation, your interpretation of Tyr might be slightly different than mine.
Yes.
Tyr in your lifespan is a different influence than it is in mine.
Yes.
Bragi is a different influence on your life versus mine. I'm a little bit of an artistic person, and I make things and I draw things, but I'm not the greatest when it comes to word wit. I can't just spit it out. There's times I'll sit down and try to write something down, and I'll throw 10 pieces of paper in the trash before I get it completely. So I think I get that. But how do we get there? What's the journey? Like I said, it took me 10 years before so how do we get there? What aspect of your life brought you to the point to where you say, okay, I can tattoo this.
Yes.
Okay, I'm comfortable putting this on my body. Okay, I have no problem representing this.
So, for me, when I first stepped into this faith, the very first thought that came to mind for me was, I fought all my life, I was in the service, I'm definitely, without a doubt, Thorsman. I even got red in my beard. And if you looked at a few of my tattoos, you would see that. I've got a lot of people who are Norse or who are pagans or heathens, they wear a Mjolnir around their necklace. You're wearing one right now. I don't wear one. The reason being is just because it's tattooed on my chest.
Right.
It's a hat on a hat for me. But I love the fact that it's becoming not only a fashion statement, but a great way for us to self-identify in public. Christians have the crucifix, they have the cross, we have the hammer. It's a great symbol. And when I first started telling and learning more about what it meant to be a Thorsman, I really grasped onto the stories of Thor, onto how he broke the bones of Nasher and Grinder, or broke the bodies of Nasher and Grinder to feed him and his compatriots, and how he had to rebind them with magic to allow them to heal overnight while they slept. The stories of how he threatened to break the bones of other gods for balding his wife. Thor, to me, was everything that you were supposed to be as a man, as someone who walked that faith. You were supposed to be a strong, borderline brutish individual, and that's not me. I'm a very large, imposing individual at times. I compete in strength sports. I actually just got back from competing at the Arnold Sports Festival last week.
Go.
Let's go. Go arm lifting.
Oh, my poor bicep.
And even some of the competitors that I met there on the pro circuit, we talked about heathenry. They were wearing their Mjolnirs loud and proud on their chest.
Yeah.
And these are Goliaths of people. These are modern-day giants who walk. But that wasn't for me. I put down my sword, my hammer, and my axe a long time ago, and I've decided to take a more peaceful route through life. But something that I love is situations like this, where I get to sit down and talk with someone else and share stories. And I've always, since a very young age, been gifted with the ability to carry on a conversation and the gift of gab. As a very young individual, I had a bit of a stutter, so I did go through some speech therapy, but now you wouldn't even be able to tell, minus a little hiccup here and there.
So let's talk about self-education. We got into a couple of rambles of the gods. So how do we learn about the gods? So okay, I like the idea of Vikings and Norse mythology and these TV shows and Netflix series that I see, and I like that, and I want to be a part of that. How do I teach myself about that? Well, it's not by watching the shows.
No. This religion is a religion with homework.
Yeah.
If you look at the libraries of your fellow heathens, you'll see stacks of leather-bound books that they had to circle and hunt and poach down in eBay markets or on Facebook Marketplace, or just collect from your friends. Yeah. A really big and slightly dangerous component that I see within heathenry especially is a term that I've heard to be called umbilical heathenry, where
what is that?
You'll find someone who knows more than you. So, for example, for you and I, at one point I came to you as a resource, and I came to you with questions, and I accepted your questions on your answers on blind faith. Mm-hmm. And if someone were to ask me that same question, I would give them your answer. And if they asked me for my source, I'd say, my buddy Matt. And that's not a source. It's a great way to have a conversation. Yeah. It's a great way to learn. But it's a great way to get your foot in the door. But once that door is open, it's up to you as a heathen, especially as a newcomer, to learn, to read, to get as much information and education as you physically can for yourself.
My education started with conversations with a group of people, and for the longest time, going to various different heathen organized events, I'd sit down on scheduled classrooms, scheduled discussions, listen, ask questions, get answers, and it wasn't really until probably the last 4 or 5 years that I actually started reading.
Yes.
I don't read very well. I'm not adept at putting words from paper into my head. It takes me a while to read. But a lot of my interest and my enthusiasm and me able to pick up bits of knowledge came from those around me that had lived the life, read the books, are much more educated than me on the subject. And then from there, I was able to go back and find the sources, read it for myself, say, okay, what this person said seems more accurate than what the other person said. Mm-hmm. And when you do that, at least for me, was you're able to create your own path, your own walkway to get to a destination that you're not quite sure what it is yet. And for the first 10 years, I didn't know I was a tearsman. I didn't know that that's what set me apart from other people. Yes, I wear a Mjolnir because I believe myself to be a warrior when the warrior necessities arise.
Yes.
But up until then, make just decisions.
Yes.
Take care of the community. make sure that family's taken care of, make the sacrifices necessary to move forward to the next day, the next week, the next month, the next year.
No, and that is one of the beautiful things I will say about learning and growing, especially as a group, is we don't necessarily have to go and read the book. There's multiple, of course, you could read the Eddas, whether it be prose or poetic. You could read the Have 'em all, which is one of my favorite Norse jokes is, why have one god when you can have them all? Yes. But now we have all of these technologically savvy heathens who are creating fantastic podcasts for us to listen to. For the people who are only listening to this, I just give a thumbs up and looked at the camera. But we have alternative sources that we can use as a means to educate ourselves to get to that next step. When we're finally ready to crack open the book, go to a seminar, go to a fantastic event like Northeast Thing or East Coast Thing if you're here in the Virginia region or if you're anywhere basically on the coast. But we are around the world, and now with things like Facebook, it's a lot easier to find those people that you can learn alongside, and you don't have to learn directly from. You can sever that connection if need be and still continue to learn without completely isolating yourself from the world that is our faith.
And I think that the general audience enjoys sitting down and watching people have a conversation so that they can listen to both sides of aspect. We can bounce ideas off each other. We can have a debate on which God is better. But you're right. You have to get to a point where you've educated yourself enough to stand by a decision that you've made, to walk the path that you've chosen. So the idea that you say, the umbilical, where someone has taken someone's word as saintly, if you would, and this way is bond. For me, it didn't really work that way. I mean, like, I had to listen to multiple points of view to get to a point where I was able to, understand, first off, what I'm reading.
Yes.
Get a better mental concept on how that applies, one, to my life, two, to the lives of those around me, and to the world that we live in. We're Americans. This religious belief system is not of our origin.
No.
There's a hashtag out there, American Heathen, because it's new to this part of the world. It's 120 years in our history, maybe max, when around, in Northern Europe, Scandinavia, it's upwards of 2,000, 2,500 years old. So it's new to us. So from an educated standpoint, you want to try to recreate something that works but honors where it came from.
Yes. And there's a saying out there, deeds over creeds, when it comes to the standpoint of honor, especially in the American Heathen or the New Heathen movement, as another hashtag that I've seen floating around on the internet, of people who want to walk the line of faith, but they just don't know where to start. And a lot of it, the creeds over the deeds over creeds, a lot of it matters more so on what are you willing to do versus what are you willing to say you'll do. It matters to a lot of people, including myself, if you tell me that you're going to help me fix my car because you are mechanically inclined and I am not. That's great, and I value your word because you have never put me in a place where I've ever had a place to question it. But what matters more to me is when you show up on Sunday morning at 10 a.m. with your socket set, because I knew you said you were going to do it, but then you showed up.
So, I mean, something similar.
And that's the
deeds over creeds. You will be held accountable.
Yes.
By your community, by individuals, and even by yourself. If you say you will do something and you don't hold your own word, you're only yourself to blame.
Yes.
And then from there, you will be looked down upon or maybe second guessed by the members in your community.
And to take that a step further, I feel like this is going to turn into a tattoo tour. One of the biggest things that really drew me to the Norse faith...
A pencil?
Ballpoint. Was the story of the Nidhogg, or the Nidhogg. At the base of Yggdrasil, the tree of life, or the world tree, there's this mighty dragon known as the Nidhogg, who, if you are a coward, if you break your oaths, if you are a oath breaker by fault, and if you are someone who is constantly belittling, lying, in other words, being a weak individual in that circumstance, we talk a little bit about the afterlife that we have for those of us in the Norse faith, but something that's not talked about is upper on my arm. I won't, I'll show you a little bit.
Yeah.
I have a Nidhogg tattoo, and it was the first of many tattoos that I got on my body when I was very loudly speaking about my pride as a heathen. And to me, it was a reminder: keep my word, keep my oaths.
Yeah.
And I'm assuming we're okay with vulgarity?
To a point.
Okay, great. If I don't want to be a piece of crap in the afterlife, then I need to make sure that I'm not one in this life.
Yeah. If you wish to have an afterlife, you need to
Yes.
lead a good life.
Exactly. And it's not rocket surgery to lead a good life.
So you talk about, leading a good life.
Yes.
And I think you would agree with me that a strong kinship with other heathen folk is of utmost importance, because that's your base, that's your community, that's those that you turn to when you have questions, or if you have concerns, or if you have problems in life. You need to have that support of those in your community. So maybe tell me about, or talk about, without going into specific details of the interworkings of the kindred that you belong to,
Yes.
but where does kinship fall in on the scale of importance in your life?
So I'm really, first and foremost, very glad that you did bring that one up, because it ties essentially our whole conversation together. When you're going out and you're finding where you fall in line with this faith, and you find yourself, almost grabbing that title of a Bragi's folk or a Thorsman or an Odinsman, now you're pointing yourself in a direction. Okay, this is the kind of life I want. Let me find people like that.
Yeah.
And then you run into those circumstances where you're getting to learn from other people, and you're building that kinship. Heathenry and kinship go like peanut butter and jelly. They go hand in hand. You cannot, in my personal opinion, walk this line of faith alone. You will have questions, you'll have doubts, and you'll have to look to an outside source to find those answers. And a lot of the times, the best answer you can get is simply by sitting down and talking with a friend.
Yeah.
You have been through experiences that I will never fathom. You have read books that I'll never read, and you've had conversations deeper and longer than any conversation I could have had with other people,
right,
and vice versa. But when I come to you and I ask you a question, when I come to you and I'm seeking kinship, my cup never goes empty.
Yeah.
Because there are people in this community and around this country that we can reach out to and constantly fill our own cup. It's important to fill your own cup, don't get me wrong. Everyone should be able to fill it themselves. But when you're feeling low, when you're a little bit dry, you have this community to reach out to and say, hey, I'm struggling. I need to find something. I need some words of wisdom. Can someone point me in the right direction?
So I've had a couple of interviews. Specifically, you can go back and look at my interview with Jeff, or if you go back and look at the interview that I had with Celtic John or Torstig, and they both bring up the aspect of, for the longest time, I felt like I was alone. I felt like I was the only one that thought this way, felt this way, believed this way, and it was an act of random occurrence that I came across somebody else, and I was in shock that there was somebody else that followed the same path that I did. And they may not walk the same path, but they parallel to it. They may sway in a different direction, but you're not alone. You're never alone. It's just finding those people.
Exactly. And much like the symbol on the beautiful tapestry you have here on the table,
The Tree of Life.
Heathenry is a lot like the Tree of Life. It's a lot like Yggdrasil. We're all climbing up different roots, but we're all going after the trunk together.
Yeah.
We all have the same goal, which is to bring honor to ourselves, to bring honor to our gods, and to do good works. And we're all going to come from different paths.
Yeah.
We're all going to come from different parts of the world, but we all want the same thing.
And I believe that I would say comfortably that a majority of heathens start solitary.
Yes.
Before they indirectly find others of the same mindset, others of the same life path, to have conversations with, to bond with, to get together with and worship, or I should say honor the gods together. communities are stronger together.
Yes.
You're not going to go out and fight a battle against an army by yourself.
No. Look how well that worked for a certain Saxon or a certain individual on a bridge. You can take out a couple hundred, but you're not going to take out the whole army.
Yeah.
And it's important to keep your hearth. Keep your hearthstead well. Make sure that you're taking care of you, yours, and your family, the people who share your hearth. But without your tribe, without your clan, without your community or your kindred, your hearth will dwindle. Mm-hmm. Your fire will eventually go out. And it's not without the fuel and the resources of the community around you that your own hearth will not prosper. You need those people. Everyone needs a community. Yeah. They say it takes a village to raise a child. Well, it takes a community to make a happy, healthy heathen.
Yeah. Speaking of kinship, then that just translates into the next word that we'll bring up, and it's kindred. So yes. A kindred is just a group of people that come together consistently to support each other consistently, to move in what is the agreed upon right direction.
Yes.
Personally, I'm not in a kindred. I am what I would say a brotherhood of men and women that think the same way as I, but we don't have a kindred.
Yes.
We have Vikings of the Valley, which has just been something that's been going on for 20 plus years, and I'm proud to be a part of it.
Right.
And that effectively is what spurred the endeavors of Locking Horns podcast, which is something that spurred the endeavors of Viking Land, which is something that Jeff's son John is putting on.
Skål.
Skål. Skål. But kindred is more of a tight-knit community, I would say.
More of a, I don't want to say a well-constructed organization, but it's definitely exactly that. It's tighter knit. In some cases, there's bylaws, there's rules that are followed, certain housekeeping that is followed during certain organizational meetings. Yeah. And for some people, that's exactly what they need. They need, especially as a newer heathen, it's very important to, follow what you're used to.
Yeah.
For me, that was important. Growing up in Bible study and Sunday school and, going to, midday service, I knew for a fact, 8 a.m. I'm walking in the door, 9 a.m. Sunday school, 10 a.m. praise and worship, 11 o'clock.
The structure
service.
Was there.
Boom, boom, boom.
Yeah.
And a lot of people don't like that. So for a lot of people, a kindred isn't for them. A lot of those people want that freedom. They want that ability to say, hey, here's what we're doing. But for people who like that organizational situation, they like that line in the sand, hey, we meet at noon. We're eating until 1, at which point we start class.
Yeah. That
for them is phenomenal. That for them is a glorious thing. I myself, I'm a little bit of a free bird. I like both. I love the organization, but my favorite part of any kind of kindred style to get together is at the very end. That hour or two where you just kind of hang out, talk, go over books, talk about what you've learned from the runes, what you've learned from other sources. Heck, just boast about what you've been through. I love hearing about my friends growing. I love hearing about people glowing up. Yeah. That's part of the reason I wanted to be on the podcast with you, is because when you told me you were starting this, my heart sang. It was a little bit deeper because I got a little bit of a sore throat at that point. So it was more like, hey. But it was just happy to hear that you were doing this. And I'm happy to be a part of this too.
Skål. I'm glad to have you here, brother. I really do appreciate having you here. So with that being said, we're going to conclude this episode, and hopefully in the future we're going to get Wolfgang back with us, and eventually, coming up in the months ahead, we're going to have sit-downs with 1 or 2 additional folk, and we're going to be discussing, debating, and conversing on interpretations of the Havamal. Because first and foremost, there are 3 famous interpretations, translations, and from those, the thousands upon thousands of people that have read it and interpreted those words themselves to their own means is going to be different than how you or I think about them. How you and I think about the way that these words were put into place. The Havamal is the words of the High One, a code of advice, if you will. So that to me is very important, that we get that out there as well.
Yes.
That's what's been going on. Pretty much since I started my Instagram has been, I'm just posting Havamal quotes. I want to get it out there.
Yes.
And once that is complete, maybe sooner, we'll be scheduling to get together. I'm excited for that. I really am.
I'm looking forward to it.
So expect to get a call to have a seat on that. But brother, until then, like and subscribe. Check us out, Facebook, YouTube. I got an Instagram, and soon maybe even Spotify. I think they're up there now. Slowly getting them up there. But until then, skål. Thank you much. Like and subscribe. Hit us up. We'll be back next time. Hails.
Hail.